So good afternoon, everyone. For those of you just joining us, my name is Sarah Ripp, and I am the Assistant Director for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program here at UW-Madison. I am delighted to introduce you to our second speaker for the afternoon session, Tim Ripp. Tim is a part-time horticulture educator for Extension Sauk County here at UW-Madison, a landscape designer for the Bruce Company located in Middleton, Wisconsin, and a beekeeper of nearly a decade. In his role as horticulture educator, Tim facilitates and develops research-based educational programs and informational materials around horticultural topics for local businesses, individuals, and families in Sauk County, including community outreach, coordinating horticulture diagnostic services, and assisting with educational programming and coordination of the Master Gardener program. In full disclosure, Tim is my husband, and I am thrilled that he has agreed to join us and share his expertise on the use of native plants in support of pollinators, something that I know is near and dear to his heart. So please join me in welcoming Tim to our workshop.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be joining you this afternoon. I will admit right away that last presentation is going to be a little hard to follow, but this will be a little lighter, I think, as an afternoon session. And anyone who has Zoom fatigue, this may be a little bit on the lighter side of things, and still very impactful when we're talking about climate change. I think, as Sarah mentioned, I am a excuse me, an educator with UW Extension through Sauk County. I became an educator after spent 28 years in the landscape architecture business doing landscape design, primarily for residential clients. I do some commercial work, but that's not really my passion. Excuse me, a little tickle here. My passion is really working with homeowners. And what I learned in my 28 years of working with homeowners is that I really spent a lot of time educating. And so it was a really nice sort of seamless marriage, if you will, to join Extension when I had the opportunity. I've been with Extension now a little over 3 years, about 3.5 years now. And as a lifelong learner myself, it's a wonderful organization to be part of and to share knowledge and information, and the colleagues I have are indispensable, really. So I know she prefaced my talk by saying, the impact on pollinators, and that will be a portion of my talk today. But really, this talk is really about changing conventions and changing mindsets and in the landscape and how we use that landscape and how we what we do to even our own backyards has a greater global impact. So that's really the crux of my talk today. So we'll get into it. I will try to stay within my time limit here and leave a little time at the end for some questions. But please feel free to reach out to me. Really through my extension is the best place if you've got questions. And I will be sharing some other information with Sarah that hopefully you can use in your classrooms if you'd like to, if any of this. I got a little something for everyone in here, I think. So I don't want to mute myself. I want to advance a screen. So this is the key points of my talk today. So number one request I get from almost every client I work with, almost the first things out of their mouths when I step onto their property is low maintenance. And so that's really kind of a double-edged sword. So I want to address that. We'll talk about the costs of conventional landscaping and what we think of as our conventional landscapes versus natural landscapes, which is kind of the shift, the paradigm shift that we're going towards more and more. Pollinators is a big buzzword these days, as rightly it should be, but it's really greater than that. So we'll talk about that a little bit. What if what if we break these conventions, and what does thinking about our landscapes, it could be your backyard, could be a local park, could be your school, it could be any place. I've really touched all of those things in my work. And then stewardship. I think that's really the backbone of all of it. What are the impacts are we having, and how does being a good steward to our land and to our environment have for what we're leaving behind, our legacy for the next generation? So those are some of the key points we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about design as well as we get through this, but we'll get started at that. So as I said, low maintenance landscapes is number one thing that I hear from every person I talk to on a daily basis. And I work with literally between my day job, my landscape architecture job, and my horticulture job with extension, I probably really touch a few hundred people a year, and it's the biggest thing. So what does that really mean? Means different things to different people for the most part, but um, when we're talking about low maintenance landscape, the average person in their back of their minds is really thinking, I don't want to do any work, right? It's all hard work. I don't want to prune, I don't want to weed, I don't want to water, less time invested. And there's something to be said for that, for sure. But um, what their conventional thoughts are and how they want to approach that needs to change a little bit. So I'm trying to turn that on its head a little bit. So um, this is what the average person sees as they drive through their neighborhoods. This is our conventional landscape, right? Acres of mowed grass, a handful of bushes here and there, a lot of monocultures. Problem with this type of landscape that we've really been infused with since the early 1950s is that it's highly manicured, so not very natural. Really, when we talk about acres and acres, I mean, depends upon where you're living, right? So if you're living in an urban environment, you have a much smaller footprint. If you're living in a more rural environment or suburban environment, your footprint is bigger. And this convention of having acres of mowed turf really lacks biodiversity. And really, in all honesty, is very, very high maintenance and takes a lot of inputs to really effectively keep looking pristine all the time, or what we've been convinced is pristine and sort of proper, right? So what happens when we change that, and where does that come from? I mean, really, where does it come from? So really, it comes from a long time ago, from the early 19th century, from garden clubs, the Golf Association, even the Department of Agriculture back in the day, we were pushing this. Every person's home is their castle. Every person's home is their castle, right? And so what did that look like? And where did we take our conventions from? As we migrated from Europe to here, we thought of aristocrats. We thought of having these acres and this carpet of green lawn to come home to. And that's really been the convention, really, post World War II. If you think about a lot of the houses and a lot of the home developments that were built since World War II, this is what we're left with, and it's still happening today on a regular basis. Any development you walk around, or that we work with, it's acres of turf and a tree and a couple of bushes, and that's it. And so is that really, though, the American dream? And that's my question there, right? Is that really what we want to strive for? Is that really what's important to us? And what does that really entail? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more here. Conventional versus natural. So I do have clients that, swear by their lawnmower. It's their therapy. I kind of always question. I get that question about low maintenance landscapes all the time. And my number one response, and kind of in jest, a little poking back, is get rid of all your grass. I have clients that will literally get on their lawnmower and ride their lawnmower for 3 hours on a Saturday morning. And personally, I have a hard time understanding why. It's not my idea of a good time. I would personally rather be fishing or spending time with my family or going on an adventure somewhere. And so that's, when we talk about low maintenance, your time is valuable. So when we talk about conventional versus a more natural landscape, there are societal misconceptions in there. People look at the conventional landscape and they think, it's well manicured, it's well maintained, but you're not thinking about all the inputs that go into that. Whereas a more natural landscape, quite often people tend to think that they're messy and unruly. So here's a couple of slides, again, similar slides, but with those sort of mindsets that we've been programmed into. And really, we've been programmed. I mean, you think about the commercials you see on TV about every season, there's a different type of fertilizer. There's a new lawnmower. There's new things to do. And really, it's pushed upon us. So what I'm really trying to do is get people to sort of break that mindset a little bit. These conventional landscapes, these highly manicured landscapes, really require a lot of time. They're high economic inputs. They are essentially ecological deserts. If you were to sample, and I've got a lot of colleagues around me in extension that have done a lot of this research, you sample what's going on as far as good pests, bad pests, just ecological ecological diversity within these more conventionally highly manicured landscapes, and they're pretty sterile. There isn't a lot going on there, and there's not a lot to help our pollinators or to help our birds. Both pollinators and birds have had a huge decline in the last 25 years. And a lot of it has to do with the impacts that we're putting in to maintain these highly manicured spaces, which I know it sounds a little counterintuitive for what I do for a living, but I'm really trying to push people towards this more natural sort of landscape. Um, People's conceptions or what we've been fed is that these natural landscapes, they're unruly, unmanaged, they're hard to maintain, and all of that is really truly false. They're a little hard to get started sometimes, depending upon your space. But say you live in a more urban environment, you're starting with a smaller footprint. So if we start with a smaller footprint, they're much more manageable. But if you think about the diversity that's there, the ecological impact we've got on a global level. And I'd like to put this in a concept too. I'm talking about people's backyards, but this really can apply to any space across the globe, really. We just work with the native plants and things that are in your area. But if we think about breaking these conventions and going towards a more natural landscape, we really have more long-term beneficial impacts for both biodiversity, pollinators, birds, plant materials, groundwater. The list goes on and on. And so there's really something to be said for starting to change that mindset a little bit. So, like I said, mythbusters, people always say, oh, natural landscapes, they're messy and they're unattractive and, they don't have curb appeal. And honestly, that's false too. If we talk to developers, we talk to real estate people, which we do in our industry, there's a lot more value to more natural sort of landscapes. Traditionally, home values are more, property values are more, neighborhood values are greater. If you think about these newly constructed developments, which I lovingly call corncob developments, where houses just pop up in cornfields, and then you look at a similar development 20 or 30 years later when things have actually matured, there's more value in a more matured sort of landscape. And so there's a way to take these spaces and really add that value. There's also, natural features like the woodland corridors, creating natural habitat ability for wildlife to move freely within these spaces. So it's just, we need to break some of these conventions and these myths. Here we are. These are our conventional landscapes. You'll drive around your neighborhoods and you'll see this every day. You'll see companies out there treating for, fungicides, adding fertilizers, spraying your lawns with chemicals for mosquitoes, which I highly don't recommend. Irrigating landscapes that really don't require irrigation. Lawns are meant to go dormant at certain times of the year, especially in our area. The impact that we have with our leaf blowers and our lawnmowers and our weed whips and just the impact that has not only on the environment but also on our social environment, on our neighbors, on the people that live in our area. There are really high costs, monetarily and socially, very high. And if you add that up in the course of a year, it adds up. And it adds up quickly. These are a little bit of old data, but the data is still good. And I would wager to say that you could probably add a multitude of at least two onto some of these numbers for what people spend in time. $228 million or 228 million Americans own some sort of lawn equipment. And think about all the things that I'm sure you have them in your own yards and in your own backyards. And we need some of those things, right? But it's not getting rid of them entirely. It's how do we use them differently? How do we manage our spaces differently so we can minimize those impacts? I always joke again, get rid of all your grass. But my hope is that when I'm done working with a client, we can eliminate a weed whip, we can eliminate time mowing, we can eliminate impacts and inputs that are going into your natural environment in your home and in your neighborhoods. Time spent mowing, and these are average yards, let's say an acre or less. People spend over almost 400 hours of their lifetime mowing their lawns. Honestly, my lawn is not a golf course lawn. I would never want that for our our family. I don't believe in adding chemical inputs into our space. We have 3 children, and I like to keep things as natural as possible. So I literally mow my lawn 3, 4, 5 times a year max. And if you do it differently, you can have lower impacts. And think about the other costs that go into it. But you can spend, it says $500 a year. I really think that's more like $1,000, $1,200 a year. If you start talking about adding in, let's say, I don't want to diminish any companies. Let's just say any company that comes out and is adding seasonal fertilizers to your lawn that probably aren't needed, are coming out and treating for weeds in your lawn, which again is probably not needed. Um, the impacts monetarily are staggering, honestly. And to me, it goes back to this time money quotient. We don't have enough of either in our lives. The average person, I don't care where you're living around the world, we don't have enough time or the money. And so let's value things a little differently so that we are investing our time wisely and we're investing our money wisely. And that's really a lot easier to do than many people think. And truly, it's just simply all too much. This is a little whimsy I add in here, but if you notice the golf course state of this person's lawn, yeah, it's an insane amount of work. And I guess if that's your idea and that's your convention of what you wish for yourselves, I'm not going to disparage that. Everybody has their own idea of home and place, but I would just again like to encourage people to start to think about those spaces differently because all of those impacts have a greater global impact. And I do feel that way sometimes. Here's the other thing I tell every client I work with. When it comes to low maintenance, there's no such thing as a garden or a landscape that is no maintenance. And so choose wisely. Do you want to spend every Saturday this summer mowing your lawn and working in your space? And I get pushback on that a lot. Um, Honestly, your lawn, your turf grass lawn will always need twice to 3 times as many inputs from you, your time, your money, your investment, than really a well-planned garden space, be it a perennial garden, a prairie garden, any of those types of spaces. So, and I know practically, there's certain HOAs, homeowner associations, different neighborhoods that require their residents to maintain their lawns in a certain way. So what we try to find is a happy medium. But what if we broke some of those conventions again and we started thinking about planning our spaces a little differently? I'm not saying all turf is bad. I'm not saying it all needs to go away. It has a place. It has a purpose. Again, it's a nice place to spread a blanket. It's a nice place to have a picnic. It's a nice place to kick a soccer ball. But you probably don't need 3 acres of mowed grass unless you have a football team or a rugby team or cricket. So let's think about how we can incorporate more natives and more just biodiversity, just more diversity of plant materials within that space. So how do we do that? So really the intent is to not eliminate turf altogether. It's to just find this happy medium and create a cohesiveness that makes sense. Like I said, we've been programmed really since before we were born to appreciate landscapes in a certain way. And so if we really think about and intentionally plan those spaces, we can find this happy medium. We can find a happy medium of usable lawn space or turf space that we can enjoy with our families in a multitude of ways, but we can also incorporate more beneficial plants that support pollinators, support wildlife, support birds, and increase beauty and increase again that biodiversity. So there is a happy medium out there, and we need to work harder, I think, to achieve that. So I'm going to talk about some design principles as well here. And I said there's a little something for everyone in this presentation. So when I talk about design principles, I'm also going to talk about natural principles too. So we'll get to that in a second. But these 5 fundamental principles of design, as I've joked and I've given this presentation in the past, and this applies to whether we're working on your landscape or we're working on a quilt, right? So there's things that are, again, as a human being, our consciousness appreciates and puts together as a whole. It's sort of gestaltism, right? Little pieces of a whole. And all of these five things really are what make spaces make sense in our minds and make us appreciate them um, in a way that is acceptable. Okay. So we're going to go through these kind of quickly, but so unity and harmony. I always say this is the uh, everything has a space and there's a space for everything. So um, it's about how we're using our spaces, right? It's about how we're tying our leisure space in with our play space, with our natural space, and really trying to find a harmony between all of those elements rather than letting one dominate another within a greater whole. So this is really an important element of sort of approaching design landscapes from design. Another element of this is balance and proportion. So our mind puts things together in such a way that if we create layers and we create balance and we repeat that within a space, it becomes understandable. It allows our mind to really grasp what's happening. And so natural landscapes aren't messy. It just is a matter of creating the right balance and proportion of the elements within the space. And that's really what creates this sort of pleasing aesthetic that so if anybody's around a botanical garden, this is a lot of what you're getting from those types of spaces. Another element in design that we really focus on is rhythm and repetition. So it's something I always say is not every space within your landscape or within the greater landscape has to be a brand new space. So creating elements of rhythm, creating elements of repetition, and you can do that through texture, you can do that through color, you can do that in a lot of different ways in the landscape. And it's a really important element to sort of direct you through the landscape and pull you through the landscape. And again, by doing this, we're adding layers that create habitat, that create diversity, and just breaking down again that convention of monoculture. Emphasis and focus is one thing that we try to do within the landscape too. Creating focal points, creating spaces, creating gathering spaces. So again, you can do this in a few different ways, but it's really a matter of creating that sort of special place within a landscape. So you can, it could be a statue, could be a sitting space, it could be a bench. There's different ways to do that. And again, using color often does that. Again, creating spaces that draw you within the larger space is part of that as well. But it all goes back to not doing too much within your space too. I'm sure many of you have heard the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. Not my favorite last word, but there's a lot to be said for that. Sometimes people try to do too much without the right sort of planning or organization. And even with the best intentions, it doesn't work for them and it creates frustration and it leads them back to, well, if I just kept, it all grass, then it's just easier. Well, it's really not. So keeping it simple, working on just a few elements, creating that balance really provides success in the long run. So how does that relate again back? How do those design elements relate back to creating these more natural spaces in our landscape? Again, those 5 design elements can apply to anything, whether you're creating a painting, a quilt, a landscape. So it's really very general. And this is where we dial it in a little bit more so that we're really starting to focus on how to do that within our environment. Or again, a neighborhood, if you're involved in any sort of city politics, city parks, your schools, creating a community garden, all of those types of things. These are really the conventions that we're trying to build towards. So what are those elements? So those elements change a little bit, and they are connectivity, plant diversity, layering your plant material. By doing all of those things, you're just naturally creating habitat diversity, you're creating shelter, you're creating these nesting sites. We're adding water sources potentially. We're creating beauty, right? I mean, um, we're painting our brush and creating seasonal interest. And a lot of that really boils down to plant selection and native plant selection in particular. Um, so we'll go through these a little bit. Connectivity, I always like to stress this because whether you have a tiny little backyard in Madison or you live in a more rural area where you've got acres and acres, or you're kind of in between in the suburban areas where maybe you have a half acre or an acre to play with, everything you do in your space has an impact and creates connectivity and creates uh, the ability for that space to relate to the greater environment. So whether you're just planting a few potted plants out in your front yard or you're creating a lush, lavish garden, it has an impact, especially for our pollinators. They will find anything you put out there that they can forage from. And so never underestimate the impact you can have within your space and how that relates to the greater space. I mentioned in here, and as you've noticed, I'm not going to read these verbatim. I'm going to make these slides available to you. So if you want to go back and read these verbatim, you can. But um, the corridor aspect of it is really important, I think. Even if we're creating our own little postage stamp of naturalness, more native plantings and a more naturalistic sort of landscape, maybe you've got a neighbor two doors down that's doing the same thing. And Madison, I think, if I don't know how many of you live in the Madison area, I think we're really fortunate. I drive around a lot of neighborhoods in Madison with my job, and I'm very pleasantly surprised quite often to see that many people who live in, let's say, the Monroe Street area or yeah, there's just different neighborhoods where they've eliminated, their tiny little front yard turf and it's planted with more native plant materials. And that's great because all of those things have a connection to the next one and the next one. And if you think about, again, the gestaltism of that, you're adding all that up and think about the impact that that has. Plant diversity is key. It really is. That's my issue with turf grass lawns is there's just no diversity there. And honestly, when you drive around and you look at these perfectly manicured golf course lawns, um, the bad news there is that that's not a native turf. It's not native, and it's partly why it'll go dormant in a drier summer. Most of those grasses are not native. If we want a really native turf grass, we really want to work with different types of fescues that work, and not a Kentucky bluegrass, which is a lot of what is grown as turf grass and really across the nation for sure. So plant diversity is huge. So when we are thinking about how we're infusing these things into our landscape, we really want to talk about working with plants that have different bloom times, have different flower shapes, because as things ebb and flow throughout the season, there's different pollinators and different actually beneficial insects that are out there at different times of the year. So let's talk about pollinators for a second. Pollinators, people think of honeybees. Honeybees, again, not native. I am a beekeeper. I love my bees, but they are not native and they are not the biggest pollinators of most of the plants and the vegetables and the food that we eat. 1/3 of every bite of food that you take, you can thank a pollinator for, and most of that is not pollinated by honeybees. Honestly, there are over 500 different species of bees just within Wisconsin alone, or the upper Midwest, and they don't even pollinate everything. We've got moths that pollinate, hummingbirds that pollinate, different beetles that'll pollinate. I even saw a frog in a flower one time. So pollen can be moved around by lots of different things. So honeybees have their place. Honeybees get used commercially in commercial crops like almonds, peaches, you name huge, again, monoculture sort of crop production in agriculture. And yes, honeybees do get the heavy lifting in a lot of those places. But if you have a small backyard orchard, it's more likely that you've got a green sweat bee that's pollinating that versus a honeybee. And the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that there's a certain amount of pollinators that are only active in the springtime, or there are certain pollinators that are only active in the fall. And so we need to have a diversity of plants out there for those pollinators throughout the growing season. And so intentionality in choosing that plant diversity is really important. Um, so layer your plantings. That's also very important. This helps create habitat. Again, it creates an organization to our eye that people understand is not messy. And so that's where I'm going with some of these things. We want to break that convention that people think natural landscapes are just a mess and too hard to maintain. And really, it's not true. It's all plant selection, and it's all using the right plant in the right space. Quite often, I come onto different Clyde sites or different projects, and I call a lot of what I see the dandelion effect, where people have wonderful intentions. They'll go to the farmer's market, they'll choose a whole bunch of native plants, they'll come home and they don't have a plan. And so what happens is they take this great big mass of grouping of plants that they bought, and they go, and they end up wherever they end up in the landscape. And really, if we take a step back and really think intentionally about how we want to use those plants in the greater landscape, we can create layering, we can create more diversity by using perennials, shrubs, evergreens, understory trees, large canopy trees, and creating different spaces within our landscape, create these microclimates. So we have a global that is at risk. But within our own space, we can create microclimates. We can create spaces that are cooler for us to enjoy, but also more beneficial, again, to our pollinators, to our birds, to our beneficial insects, and really to our neighborhood as a whole, and create more of a cooling effect. So a lot of research being done on urban tree development, which I'm not really going to get into here today, but and how that impacts our neighborhoods. And so those things are really important. If you do all the other things I just mentioned, what you're going to get is habitat diversity. And habitat diversity is really the end all be all goal of all of it. We want to use these plants in an intentional way and use our landscapes in an intentional way to create habitat diversity. Habitat diversity allows for wildlife to flourish, insects to flourish. I see too many ads and companies out there that want to come and fog your yard for mosquitoes. But what they're not telling you is that they're also killing really any insect that will land on those plants. So if we create diversity within our habitat, we can create spaces for what we call integrated pest management, which means that we're not only creating beneficial habitat to pollinators, but we're also creating spaces for things like bats, right? Bats are a better effective means of getting rid of mosquitoes than fogging your backyard will ever be. So we're going to get into that a little bit too with talking about shelters and nesting sites. Put up a bat house, put up a bee house. Now, bee houses, people get bee houses, and I'll just say quickly that the bee houses you get for our minor bees and our nesting bees are great. Um, they do need maintenance, and they do need to be cleaned out on an annual basis, which people don't often observe. And so without doing that, we can be causing some other fungal pathogens and other diseases, which is not always great, but the intention is good. It is an excellent exercise to do with your students if you're looking for some kind of an exercise. I just encourage you to encourage them to use a pipe cleaner at the end of the season and just clean them out, and let the bees kind of take over again. But it's really important. That can, like I said, it can be butterfly houses, can be bee houses, can be bat houses. But it's as simple as also leaving things within your landscape that pollinators and other beneficial insects can use to shelter in. And it's a big question I deal with too in my profession is, what do I do with my landscape in the fall? People want to rake up every leaf, and they want to cut down every bush and shrub and cut down all their grasses and put them in a bag and tidy them off. And there's really not a lot of need to do that in certain spaces. We need to leave some of that alone so that we have places for our pollinators and other insects to overwinter. We eliminate their habitat and we eliminate them. So those are important things. One other thing I have on here is water. Um, Usually in our area, water isn't a huge problem, but it never hurts to have a little bit of water out in the landscape. People always say, "Oh, what about mosquitoes?" Well, if you know anything about mosquitoes, mosquitoes take about 10 days gestation to go from egg to biting you. So if you empty those regularly, turn over anything in your yard that might be holding water for more than a week, you're really going to eliminate that issue. I do incorporate a lot of, ponds and pondless water features into the landscapes that I do. And anything that has moving water too, you're really not going to have an issue with things like mosquitoes. You're not going to increase that at all. So the thing we're getting out of all of these things is this seasonal interest. So again, we want to have something, and the diversity goes into having something of interest all 4 seasons. People often, easily think of the apple trees in bloom and the tulips in bloom in spring, or the beautiful fall colors of the trees, or your midsummer prairie garden. But the thing that often gets overlooked is a winter garden. And this is where it goes back to, we don't need to strip our landscapes bare in the winter. If we leave our grasses, we leave our perennials, we leave some of these things standing, they actually create a lot of visual interest in the wintertime, as you can see from this picture down below. These plant materials covered with hoarfrost on a crisp, clear December morning are spectacular. And the other thing they're doing is they're providing a lot of habitat for insects that are sort of stem boring insects. So there's a lot of advantageousness to leaving your landscape alone in the fall and the winter. Oh, we talked a little bit about natural plant selection or native plant selection. So we really want to focus on natives. My friend Lisa Johnson, who is with Extension in Dane County, also encourages people to think about there's cultivars of natives, so we call nativars. There's been some research done. So if you don't want to have a 4 foot tall Joe Pyeweed in your yard, they're typically cultivars of natives that are equally as beneficial to pollinators, that are a little more tidy sometimes, or a little more manageable sometimes. You know, not everybody has a space for some of these big native plants. But natives are important because our pollinators have evolved with them over time, right? It's kind of a no-brainer in a way. We want to provide things that are native in our landscape, eliminate as many ornamental things. It's kind of twofold again. If we're doing that, we're benefiting our pollinators, we're benefiting our natural environment. Native plants tend to have deeper root structures, which naturally aerates the soil. It creates better water quality. Um, but also it's a lower impact on you. When we go back to that time money quotient and our low maintenance, what does low maintenance mean? If we work with natives, we're applying less pesticides, we're applying less fungicides, we're applying just less inputs in general, because they are meant to be here. They have evolved to be in our space. And we've done a really good job of in the last, well, the mindset is changing again. Everything is cyclical, but in that post World War II era, we eliminated so many of these native things from our landscapes and brought in things that really didn't belong within our space. And now we're kind of on the rebound of that with a lot of spaces. So native plant selection is really key to all of it. And the last thing I like to say when we start talking about breaking these conventions, what might be messy to somebody is not messy to the other. But if you create a human element to it, create organized spaces, you create a neat, clean edge to some of these spaces. I always say farmers kind of have it right. Like their fields can be as wild and crazy and messy as possible, but if they tidy up their edges, it makes sense and it feels organized. And people respect that. And we can do the same thing in our landscape. So keeping things organized, creating intentionality within our spaces, creating places to be within our spaces are all part of that experience as well. So that's my spiel on design and impact. And now I'm going to get into a little bit, well, with my time remaining, I'm not pushing it too close yet. Is, why? And being a good steward is really the why, right? Well, what's our what's our impact? What is our legacy going to be? What are we leaving behind? What do all of our impacts have to do on our environment? And honestly, if you're looking for a really great reading assignment for any of your classrooms that has to deal around the environment, this gentleman on the screen right here is the granddaddy. And his book, pardon me, I'm sorry, I got a little choked up there. His book, The San County Almanac, is celebrating its 75th year this year. And um, it, it's a great read. It's a great just convention to follow. So I take his words to heart. So we'll get into that. This is where I go back to why I drive around all the time and I just shake my head. People want low maintenance, they want low impacts, and yet this is what I see. Bags of leaves from Home Depot. Why are we putting that in the landfill? Leaf blowers going at all hours of the day. Why? Again, the Natural Wildlife Federation, 18% of all municipal solid waste collected is organic yard waste. Okay. Again, I don't care if you have a postage stamp yard in Madison or another urban environment or 5 acres out in the country. There's a place to compost. There's a place to use that yard waste. There's a place to recycle it. It should never end up in our landfills. Number one impact of besides CO2, mind you, is methane, and organic waste in our landfills. It has a huge impact, be it your garden scraps, be it your food scraps. All of those things really don't belong in our landfills, and there's ways to manage those better than what we're doing now. Besides the fact that, every one of those bags you just filled up with leaves just cost you, I don't know, $15, right? And a trip to Home Depot, gas, fuel, time. I've got better things to do. I like fishing. I'd rather go fishing. So there's just different ways to think about it. Here's the impacts. Gasoline powered lawnmowers. So let's talk about being a good steward, not only to our environment, but to our neighborhoods, to our neighbors, to their spaces. Say you're hanging out on your patio having a birthday party and your next door neighbor decides it's the day to bust out that leaf blower and get every last leaf off the lawn. Not needed. 82 to 90 decibels. You see at the bottom, that's a rock concert. So that really has a social impact on your living environment and your space. We talk about weed whips, hedge trimmer. If you're planting native plants and we're planting them intentionally and we're planting the right plant in the right space, hedge trimmers and weed whips are obsolete. They're not needed. If you're gonna mow your lawn, which I encourage people to do, right? If you have some turf grass, get a mulching mower. Mow those leaves right back into your soil. We've got some wonderful turf grass specialists at the university that will tell you exactly the same thing, even if your lawn looks like a golf course lawn. Don't mow your lawn down to 2 inches. Leave it at 3 or 4 inches. A big movement, and I don't have a slide on this, well, I shouldn't say everyone, I'm overgeneralizing. The No Mow May movement, most people have heard of that No Mow May movement. And I was fortunate enough to be on a team of colleagues with Extension that kind of rewrote the rules on that a little bit. And there's a publication that I'll share with Sarah that I can share with the rest of you later that we worked up with a bunch of specialists from the university called What's the Deal with No Mow May? And really what it boils down to is if your lawn looks like a golf course, doesn't matter if you don't mow it for the month of May. There's no benefits to pollinators in that lawn at all. If your lawn has dandelions in it, has some clover in it, great. Really? Still doesn't mean you don't need to mow it for the whole month of May. What we'd really rather encourage people to do is mow less frequently and mow high. So if you set your lawnmower up higher, you'll actually find that you mow less. Sounds counterintuitive, but if you set your lawnmower so you're mowing at 3 or 4 inches, your lawn will grow less quickly, and actually the root structure will improve. So if you think about what's growing on top, mirror that in your turf grass with what's growing below. So if you're scalping your lawn to an inch and a half or 2 inches or keeping that golf course appearance, your root structure is only about the same. If you let that grass grow, let it get up to almost ready to go to seed and then mow it, you're actually going to improve the root structure, which improves the aeration of your soil, which improves just overall soil health. People say, "Oh, I hate Japanese beetles." And then I ask them, "What does your lawn look like?" And they say, "Oh, well, I trim my lawn very, very low." Japanese beetles love golf course lawns. They do. They love to bury their little eggs in there, and the grubs come out and they destroy your lawn, and then they destroy your plants. Um, so everything has an effect, right? So I encourage you to look at some of that information. But uh, again, breaking this convention, we break some of these things and we become better stewards. Here's my other spiel. Again, there's no need to remove every single leaf from your lawn in the fall. Yes, do you want to remove some of them? Yes, you don't want that to impact your grass. That can have detrimental effects, but invest in a mulching mower and you'll be a lot happier and so will your lawn. All I'm saying is here is that if you work with some of these techniques, you'll have lower impacts, and, and you create your own compost. And you talked about already of low maintenance landscapes anymore. Anyways, so just to summarize, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Oh, we
Just
can
to,
see you and hear you now.
okay. Just to summarize, uh, there's a lot of things that can be accomplished through organized planning. We want to lower inputs. We want to reduce long-term maintenance. We're going to free up some time in our space. These are all advantages of going with a more natural landscape. We're going to increase biodiversity. We're going to reduce our carbon footprint. We're going to reduce noise pollution. And we really want to be more environmentally friendly just in general. I'm going to try to do this one last time. Can you see that again? You can see my screen again. Okay, great. So I'm basically at the end of the presentation here, but I'm sorry I always like this last quote though. So, there's a lot of great organizations out there. Xerxes Society, obviously UW Extension, Horticulture, the Wild Ones. If you can get involved or get in touch with any of these organizations, it's great. A lot of fantastic work is also being done at the University of Minnesota through their B Lab. We partner with them. We partner with Michigan State, has a lot of great information. I've got a few different resources on here. Again, I'll share all this with Sarah to pass on to you guys. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them in the short time I have, if I have any time left. Otherwise, my contact information is there. Like I said, I'm an educator as well. So if you want to contact me through Extension, I'm happy to answer your questions. That's what I do.
First of all, your first comment was that it was a great and impassioned presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, the next one was from my colleague Mary, who says, this was such a fantastic presentation. Thank you for putting all the information and tips on the slides, which we will share with all the participants. One question, do you need to add some movement to standing water so it doesn't become a breeding ground for mosquitoes? Or did you say it's better to allow mosquitoes to breed? Question number one.
Yeah, no, okay. So if you're going to incorporate water into your landscape, be it a bird bath or anything else, I encourage anything that's stagnant water to be emptied about once a week. Like I said, it takes mosquitoes about 10 days from laying their egg to biting you on your patio. So, PJ Leash, our resident entomologist and insect guru, would advise the same thing. So the best way to eliminate mosquitoes from your yard is not to spray.
Cliffhanger.
That might be laying there that can hold water. Could be as simple as having eliminate those. I'm going to shut my video off because my internet is still weird. I hope you can still hear me.
We
Can you still hear
can.
me?
Yep.
Oh, did you lose me again?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry.
You're good.
Um, Good. So that's the biggest thing. So if you can incorporate any movement in the water, that disrupts the eggs of the mosquito. So that's great. So I have pondless water features where the water's cycling all the time. Mosquitoes can't live in that environment. So next question.
Yeah. Tim, I'm going to take over for Sarah so she can check in with our next speaker.
Sure.
So, our next question is, many students make money lawn mowing for others. What are other landscaping opportunities for those students as a replacement job?
Yeah, I hear that a lot. So again, there's always going to be somebody out there that wants you to mow their lawn. All I would say is make sure that you're setting your mower high, which is great. But there's also there will always be some weeding to do. As I said, no garden or landscape is no maintenance. So weeding, yard cleanup after big storms. I mean, those branches and things do need to have a space to go. Um, get involved in landscaping. We can always use more people out there helping us implement these spaces. It's great. Work in a community garden. There's lots of things you can do.
And along those same lines, what can we put in our lawns in place of grass that can still work as a play space?
Mm. Well, um, again, it isn't necessarily again about eliminating your turf grass entirely, but there are better turf grasses out there than what we've conventionally been using. Okay, traditionally, let's say pre-World War II, or actually even just after World War II, it's really been in the last 20 to 30 years that we've eliminated things like clover from our lawn seed. So if you can find a lawn mix that has clover in it, or you can let those, you know, deal with those dandelions. I know people, oh, dandelions. Dandelions have so much beneficial impact to pollinators in the beginning of the season. They're some of the very first things that create pollen and nectar for our pollinators, that they're highly important. If you can't stand them, I always say, well, if you can stand them but don't want them to go to seed, then right before they go to seed, then mow your lawn. Okay. If you wait for them to go to seed, that's really what creates the bigger issue. But there are also low mow or no mow fescues you can use in certain lawn spaces. So if it's a highly trafficked area, it's an area you're using to play soccer regularly, then you probably want a turf grass. But again, I'd pick a turf grass that has clover in it or some other beneficial things in it, more native things in it than just Kentucky bluegrass. But if it's a secondary turf grass space, some of our low fescues, which are natives, are great for those types of spaces. And you only have to mow them maybe 3 times a year, which is fantastic.
Great. One other kind of lawn maintenance seasonal question, though. We hear
Mhm.
a lot, especially in Madison, about how roads and sidewalks should be treated in the wintertime as far as how that impacts the groundwater. Could you, and if you're not positioned to speak on this, please let me know, but what is your advice on things that we can do in the wintertime as far as snow treatment and ice treatment for driveways, sidewalks, etc., that can have an impact on pollinators and that type of thing, if there's any impact to be had during the wintertime?
Eliminate your use of salt as much as possible. And that's really number one. There's kind of a hidden gem that I have that I use around my place. Now, I don't live in Madison, full disclosure. I live in a more suburban or rural environment. But actually, and you can find this at your local co-op or even some garden centers. If you find something called barn lime, that's a really wonderful product to put down because it doesn't have the same kind of negative impacts to either our water or our plant materials that salt does. And it actually sticks to ice versus melting through it. Sometimes you put salt on and it just melts through the ice and all you've got is more ice. Sometimes you put sand down and it just sweeps off the ice. If you put down a mixture of sand and a little bit of barn lime, which is just a white crushed up lime material, um, we don't need to in our environment too much, but you can add lime to your lawn to help amend the soils too. So it doesn't have any negative impacts on plant material typically. I'll tell you this though, too much of anything is not a good thing. But I like this mixture of a little bit of sand and a little bit of barn lime. Barn lime costs like $2 for like a 50-pound bag, and I keep it in the back of my car all season long because it sticks to ice. And so The one thing you do have to be careful of is you can easily track it into your home. So I highly recommend taking off your shoes when you walk into your house, so you'll track that all over your house. But it's a wonderful product that is often overlooked and nobody really talks about.
That's really great advice. Thank you. I
Yeah.
know it's been a very hot topic, especially as we were kind of driving on sheets of ice in certain parts of
Yeah.
the
Regularly last winter was all ice. If you
Yes,
call
yes.
that winter.
Yeah.
Anyway, but
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I think it's a neat alternative. I mean, if you ever get stuck in your car in a ditch, you can actually coat your tire with this stuff. It sticks. It just sticks to everything, which is a great thing. It's one of my little tricks. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that actually was our last question. So
Okay.
thank you, Tim, so much for sharing your time and your
Sorry,
expertise.
Andrea.
Oh, yes, Eleanor,
And
go ahead.
one more question, because I think we still have we still have a
please.
little bit of time.
Yes.
Sure.
I just really quickly, because you're a person who works outdoors,
Yeah.
and you've been in Wisconsin or in the Midwest for a while,
My whole life.
I was wondering if you could. I think that people who work outdoors often notice seasonal changes that we don't, as people who are working in offices. And I'm wondering if you've noticed any positive environmental changes that you've seen in this region since you were younger. So we've been talking a lot about, all of the detrimental effects of lawns and DDT was mentioned earlier in another talk. And I'm wondering if you can talk about if you've seen any changes in the environment since more and more people have been, how impactful is this? How effective has it been to have more natural space available?
The problem is we're overcoming, like I said, 30 to 50 years of a convention that has had negative impacts. So the positive impacts are great. And again, in these neighborhoods or environments where you're seeing more naturalized landscapes, it's very apparent. If you stand there, you're going to see more birds, you're going to see more pollinators, because it's sort of that old adage, if you build it, they will come. And it's so true. It really takes one season and you'll have that. Now we are again fighting this uphill battle against, increased storms and temperature changes, and that's changing sort of how we look at what plants we're selecting for our landscapes. But I just can't underscore enough how important it is to push this back the other direction and to really bring those natives back into our landscapes and really focus on those, because they do have a huge impact. Even so far as like counties, different counties are planting the roadsides with more wildflower mixes now rather than just mowing everything down. That has a huge impact. It really does. So I can't point to one specific example. I wish I could. But every little bit we do, and that's why I stress that connectivity has an impact. And again, even if you live in an apartment and all you've got is a balcony, if you can put a pot of zinnias out there, the pollinators will find it. I guarantee it. And that has an impact. So every little bit helps.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
So Sarah is helping our last speaker of the day get connected, which I think we're just succeeding with now. So everyone, please help me thank
Great.
Tim for his time and his expertise today. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your energy and your passion for everything that you presented today. It was a really great way to kind of get us energized, I think, to kind of reset the way we think about a lot of the things that you shared. So thank you very much, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. I hope it's a nice transition into your next talk. So I appreciate being here. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.